We at The Guardian got hold of two separate sources who told us independently that one of the victims of this illegal voicemail hacking was the 13-year-old Surrey schoolgirl Millie Dowler, who we now know was abducted and murdered. And we discovered that during the period of time when she was missing and there was no explanation for what had happened to her, the News of the World were using a private investigator to listen to her voicemail. Now that in itself was horrid, because you're talking about a period when her friends and family are calling her on her mobile phone and are terribly worried about her, and they're imploring her to come home, and they're crying on the phone, and it's deeply personal stuff, and they're the News of the World listening to it. That feels wrong. But where it then got worse was that the voicemail box on Millie's phone filled up. The News of the World were hungry for more information, for more stories, so they intervened and deleted the messages. Well, of course, for the family and friends who were calling in and who had heard that the voicemail box was full, suddenly it wasn't full anymore. So naturally enough, they concluded that Millie herself had deleted her messages, therefore she was still alive, and she wasn't. The Millie Dowler story changed the politics of the whole saga, and it made it really impossible for anybody to defend the News of the World, and that included the Prime Minister and the Tory leadership.
Let me be very clear. Yes, we do need to have an inquiry, possibly inquiries into what has happened. Let us be clear. We are no longer talking here about politicians and celebrities. We're talking about murder victims, potentially terrorist victims, having their phones hacked into. It is absolutely disgusting what has taken place, and I think everyone in this House, and indeed this country, will be revolted by what they've heard and what they've seen on their television screens.
And so they've, so to speak, switched sides. They've switched sides specifically on the question of whether or not there should be a public inquiry. And David Cameron, in fact, announced not just one, but two public inquiries. One into the long-term and shocking failure of the Metropolitan Police to get anywhere close to telling the truth about this until very recently. And the second is into the misbehaviour of the News of the World and the media generally. Well, so it's very important that the public inquiry doesn't become a way of kicking the whole issue into the long grass and forgetting about it. So, first of all, I would think you've got to have a judge in charge of these inquiries. And whoever it is who is in charge has to have real power to compel witnesses to come and give evidence and to order the disclosure of paperwork or emails or whatever other material is needed to get to the truth. And if they've got those powers, they then need the right terms of reference. There's no point wording it in a kind of yes minister kind of way so that they don't actually look to try to get the truth. So right now, when the political pressure is so intense, is the time to get that sorted out, the powers and the terms of reference, so that we get a proper inquiry that will report reasonably quickly. It's about power, and the power elite, the way that the people in the power elite tend to look after each other. And I think it's reasonable for any of us to observe that the Murdoch Corporation has too much power. It's evident from the way in which the police, the Press Complaints Commission, and some politicians automatically backed off and said, let's not cause trouble, they might hurt us, that they already had too much power when all this was going on. It seems to me highly unlikely that it could be in the interests of our society as a whole to give that too powerful group yet more power. Currently, the Metropolitan Police are doing an amazingly good, thorough, aggressive job of getting to the bottom of this. At last. For 4 years before that, they behaved with the most disgraceful dishonesty. They utterly failed to try to get to the bottom of this, and it looks very much as though their failure was born out of a fear of causing trouble with this powerful newspaper empire. So they were effectively putting Rupert Murdoch's newspapers above the law. And secondly, in statements which they have made to the public and the press and Parliament, they have repeatedly failed to be frank with the facts. And I think that there are senior officers at the Metropolitan Police who must be considering whether they should resign. This thing's burning out of control, and there is nobody who has been involved with the News of the World who is safe. And that is because, primarily, of the police operation, which is just tearing through this. So the police have got hold of all of the material that the private investigator Glenn Mulcair was keeping in his house. They've got hold of most of the email archive from the News of the World, all those messages sent and received. Every time they arrest somebody, they take things from their desk and from their home. They've got masses of evidence. Nobody knows quite what evidence the police have now got. Everybody knows they've got an enormous amount of evidence. Therefore, nobody at News International is safe, potentially, from what that evidence may show. All of them, from the most junior reporter to the most senior executive, will be extremely worried about the genuine prospect that somebody is going to knock on their door and arrest them and question them and end up charging them with a criminal offence. It's got that bad. There is no limit, really, to who the police may turn up and arrest. Since this has become a scandal, he's become involved, and he may or may not have been entirely frank, and he may or may not have put the right policies in place. His son James Murdoch is in some trouble because in the early stages of the scandal emerging, at least 2 people sued and were paid what you could reasonably call hush money. Huge, hundreds of thousands of pounds to go silent and go away. I'm thinking in particular of Gordon Taylor from the Professional Footballers Association and Max Clifford, the celebrity PR, who between them got a couple of million quid in damages and costs. James Murdoch was involved in authorising those payments. And that puts him in at least a moral grey area. What are you doing covering up evidence of your organisation's involvement in crime? That may not be illegal, but it smells bad. That's not good behaviour, is it? News International play dirty whenever they have to. And at the moment they are clearly willing to throw Andy Coulson to the wolves in order to try to protect Rebecca Brooks. And I think anybody who's looked at the News of the World's behaviour on the way through this will say, well, that's yet another immoral step to take. And who knows whether it will succeed. If the police find evidence that suggests they should be arresting and charging Rebecca Brooks, they're going to do it. It doesn't really matter whether News International have thrown Andy Coulson out. They'll go for her. One of the differences between Rebecca Brooks and Andy Coulson is that Coulson's no longer part of the empire. He's out, whereas Rebecca Brooks is the boss in the United Kingdom. She's the chief executive of News International. And as I understand it, she has a very close personal relationship to Rupert Murdoch, who looks upon her as some sort of daughter he never had kind of thing. But this is one of those rare cases where the Murdochs can't control events. They've lost it. The police are in charge, not them. And insofar as The Guardian and a few other newspapers are following what the police are doing, we're making it even more difficult for them. The Murdochs have lost control of this. In October 2005, the News of the World published a story about George Osborne's connection with a prostitute who took cocaine. I know from journalists who worked on the News of the World at that time that while they were researching that story, they were also looking into the question of whether or not David Cameron was in the habit of using cocaine. As far as they were concerned, they never came to an answer. The journalists I've spoken to say that they believe that at that time, Glenn Mulcair helped them to hack the phones of George Osborne and also David Cameron. So I wasn't surprised when the police went to Osborne to tell him that he had been targeted. What I'm waiting to discover is whether the police find evidence that David Cameron was also. The Press Complaints Commission are in terrible trouble. They've handled this issue so badly that they've jeopardised the whole concept of the self-regulation of the press. So when the original scandal first started to emerge at the time of the trial in January 2007, they produced a report that was completely worthless. The team at the PCC who were responsible for that bad report moved on, and the replacement team then produced a second report after we started publishing stories about it. That report was even worse. So they've really, really discredited themselves. And I think most reasonable people expect that the current chair of the Press Complaints Commission, Lady Buscombe, has to resign. It's really rather surprising that she hasn't already resigned. Really, really, if self-regulation of the press has got any chance of surviving, Lady Buscombe has to see reality. Parliament is going to have to do something to protect the privacy of everybody. You see, it isn't just the celebrities. It's Mr. and Mrs. Dowler and their missing daughter. It's anybody who does anything which could conceivably create a newspaper story. Anybody is at jeopardy from that kind of behaviour. So everybody needs to be protected from it now. To me, it isn't a story about journalists behaving badly. It's a story about the power elite. It's about the most powerful news organisation in the world. It's about the most powerful police force in the country. It's about the most powerful political party in the country. And for good measure, it's about the Press Complaints Commission. And about how they all spontaneously colluded together to make everybody's life easier. About the way in which they casually assumed that the law didn't apply to them. And in which they equally casually assumed that it was perfectly all right to lie to the rest of us because we're little people. We wouldn't know that they were doing it. And I think that's really what makes me ultimately feel angry about it, is the arrogance of those assumptions in the power elite.